here with us this evening. This event formally kicks off our 2017 Homecoming Week, so yay to homecoming. Now, in my role with the university, I have the great privilege of meeting with members of the Northeastern community all over the world, from alumni and our students pursuing co-ops, to parents, faculty, and employers. In fact, last night, I've only just returned from London, where I had the chance to be with the approximately 130 students who are beginning their Northeastern journey through the NUN program. And as many of you may know, we now have 10 NUN sites around the world. And so this, along with our presence in 136 different countries where our students are living and working now, and our almost 300,000 alumni worldwide, has really got me thinking in the last couple of days about what homecoming, what that term actually means. And if you think about it, for most universities, what it means, it's a time to return to campus, a time to return to a set of traditions, a set of memories, and all of them commemorating what happened, commemorating the past. And that's really, it's wonderful. I'm a historian, so I love the past. But you know, the past can be a bit static, and we all know from our engagement with Northeastern that this is a university that is really a little bit different. At Northeastern, we honor our history, but we are really always looking to our future. Our experiential model means that every student's experience is unique and singular and individual. So for me, what really builds that connectivity at Northeastern are the many, many ways in which we communicate those experiences to one another to bring ourselves together as a greater whole. So for me, what homecoming actually means is wherever, whenever, and however members of our community come together to share their stories. And that's the reason I am so excited for this evening's program featuring Maureen Chiquet. She is a woman who embodies what it means to be open to experience and who has been exceptionally generous in sharing her own story. I'm also really honored that our conversation with Maureen will be led by another exceptional woman, Linda Pizzuti Henry. Linda is Managing Director of the Boston Globe, the co-founder of Hub Week, and a tireless advocate for the city of Boston and for the women and the men who make it great. So please join me in welcoming Linda and Maureen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome. I'm so excited about this conversation. I want to start by just taking a few minutes and thanking Northeastern, because this is an incredible university, and I work with a lot of the different schools, and I'm always amazed by how forward-thinking and how innovative this particular university is. Joseph Ayoun is an absolute visionary, and I've worked with him on other programs. At the Boston Globe, we have around 30 co-ops at a time, and they are incredible incredible co-ops, smart, capable, really eager to learn. We also have a ton of co-ops at the Red Sox. So we're really proud to partner with Northeastern in many ways. My dad went to Northeastern. My niece, Christina Brzezinski, is a sophomore here. So I have a huge affection and a huge amount of respect. So for the students here, congratulations. I think you've chosen really, really well. And Maureen, I love your story. And you've had such a fascinating journey. And for our college students here, there's a lot of pressure, especially for those that are going into business. You were a CEO who did not go to business school.
No, sadly not. Or sadly or happily, maybe.
But you drew so much inspiration from your college years, and you didn't follow this direct path. So can you tell us the story of your time at Yale?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think almost I'd like to start a little earlier than actually getting to college, because when I was 16, I fell in love with France. Now, you know, as we do, I had a great teacher. She spoke beautiful French. My father spoke really good French, and I kind of really wanted to be like my dad. And so I fell in love with the idea of going to France, being French, seeing all these beautiful monuments, speaking the language. And I went the first time when I was 16 years old, and just did one of those stays in a family in the summer, and went to the south of France, which was even more gorgeous, and got completely seduced by the beautiful light that hit the limestone and the smell of lavender and everything that was French, the food, goat cheese, as you know from the book. I have a story about goat cheese. But it was formative for me, because I think that stuck with me even through my studies at Yale. Now, by the time I got to Yale, I actually studied literature, because my second big love, other than France, was a love of stories. And I was a really shy, and by the way, I'm super shy still. I know it doesn't always show, and you hear about CEOs, you don't really think shy, but I'm very shy. So I was a shy kid, and what that meant for me, and by the way, I was so shy that I used to hide behind my mom's skirt when she had company, if you can believe that. But what that meant for me is that I actually found my solace and found my companionship in these stories. And I would raid my parents' bookshelf. I would watch TV nonstop, movies, anything with a story. And it was through stories that I began to learn. They were not only about other people, other cultures, but also about myself. Because when you read a story, often you look at those characters and you think, how am I like or not like that character? And you kind of project yourself into the characters. So by the time I got to Yale, I studied literature. And I, very excitingly graduated with my literature major, and not knowing anything that I could do there. I mean, it was, what do you do in the world when you have a literature major? This was my conundrum, and I bet it's hard to see if are there students out there? Yeah? Oh, cool. Are there any literature majors? I see one, yay, two, a couple. It's kind of daunting, right? Because you're like, what do you do if I don't want to go back into academia? What do I do with my literature major? And for me, what happened is I ended up taking this really interesting class that actually helped me figure out what to do with that major to a certain degree, although I must say I didn't really know upon graduating. The class was in French New Wave film. I thought about studying literature, but studying visual literature through film or through theater. And so what that ended up teaching me was a lot about how emotion gets related through visual images and through sound. So I graduated Yale, I've got my literature major, I have no idea what I want to do. I decided I didn't want to go into iBanking or management consulting, because I hadn't taken one economics class. I don't think I made it up to Science Hill, the part of Yale that has science. So I was not a candidate for anything serious like that. So my dad was a lawyer, so I thought, well, maybe I should just be a lawyer, and I went to take the LSAT. And uncharacteristically, I studied a lot in college. So uncharacteristically, I did not buy that big LSAT tome, and I didn't study. I got in front of the test, and the words were like swimming. And I started guessing. I got to about the sixth guess. I raised my hand. I said to the proctor, "Can you take this away? I don't think I can be a lawyer." He looked at me like I had 10 heads. He said, "Fine, we won't record the results of your test." And I ended up, on that note, going back to France. Now, why the literature part is important is my first job was an internship. Not guaranteed to be a job at all. I ended up going to France really not knowing what I was going to be able to do. It was an internship in marketing. I knew how to spell marketing, but I did not know much else about marketing at that point. That was about it. But it turned out that this studying of story, looking at images, understanding how images and words worked together to create emotion, was the perfect background for my marketing job. Long story, but yeah.
I mean, it's always this question of what prepares you and the value of the liberal arts, and that was one of the themes that I felt throughout all of your stories, is how you just kept drawing back on what you learned, how you learned to observe, and how your attention and study of the arts kept supporting you in the business world.
Right.
You also, to go one more question on the for the students. There's also students today. They have so much opportunity, and they are under so much pressure. You went through this with your two daughters.
Right.
What advice do you have for them with this need? You and I share a similar disdain for the word perfect, but this feeling that they have to have everything on their resume in order to be able to get that job.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I know how competitive it is because my daughter just graduated a few years ago and went through, you know, a really hard time trying to figure out not just trying to get the job, but actually figuring out what she wanted to do because she was an art history major. So I think,
At Yale.
At Yale. You know, there are a couple questions I ask myself. I always hesitate to give advice because your experience is going to be different from mine. But I like to ask myself questions, and they're questions that I feel like I've been in pretty much my entire life. I'm in today still. I was in as a graduate at Yale, and that is, first, what do I really, really care about? And I hate to use the word passion because I think it's overused, and people sort of talk about passion as if it's a job type. This isn't passion. This is the thing that you can't live without. The thing that if you take it away, you're going to really be sad. And I think about, for me, that was France. That was stories. Like, I had to be close to France. You know, it was something that was non-negotiable. So what are those things, or what are the classes that you've taken that really struck a note? You know, was there a religious studies class? If so, what about it made you excited? Because it's sort of getting underneath the titles, the labels, the expectations, to your point. So first identifying that passion. And then I think the second thing is trying to really figure out what you're good at. And all this sounds really easy. Yep. But I'm not sure it's all that easy to think about, what do I really care about? What am I really, really good at? And where can I make a unique mark? So for me, what I found, for example, my first job was at L'Oreal, my training, basically. I was a trainee. And what I found is that I hadn't gone to business school. I didn't have a degree. I didn't know all the marketing terms, USP, market segmentation. I mean, all my colleagues had gone to French business schools. But my uniqueness was carved by that use of image, or understanding emotion that was coming from both image and text. And it was there that I ended up crafting my own career. So what do you care about? You know, what do you think you're really good at and where you can make a unique mark? And then what situation are you in? You know, sometimes you got to take a job. You got to take a job that you don't like. I mean, it's happened to me before. It just happened to my daughter. And I think, you know, we often, I think, coming out of college, we think, or business school even, we think that that job is like the most important job that we'll ever get. Well, and I can tell you, sort of after 35 years of career, it certainly will teach you something, but it probably won't be the last job you'll get. So I think, you know, just having that explorer's mind and going into it with a curiosity and questions, both about where you are, but also about, you know, sort of what it is that you care most about and what you can do well.
You had such a sense of adventure when you took these different opportunities, and you did talk a lot about the labels that you had too. Oh, why, thank you.
Here, right? Well, I mean, you get thirsty up here.
Thanks. And you know, you talked about your label when you were at L'Oreal and what that meant, but then how you owned it, and the same thing with your label at the Gap and what it meant, and then you grew out of it. So can you talk to us about, so we're expanding on that on your first job, even if sometimes it's just getting into the right company for you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, so what happened, obviously, when I went to L'Oreal, I had not, like I said, I didn't know much about marketing, and I really couldn't be a marketer like my colleagues. I didn't have the background. I had to learn from the bottom up, obviously, to catch up to where they were in terms of understanding the charts and the graphs and the terminology. But what was important to me was going beyond the label of marketing and creating my own sense of that. And so, for example, in very, very early on, we would have meetings with our ad agency. And right away, as soon as I sat down with the ad agency and they started to show pictures, my eyes lit up. And I found myself kind of scooting towards the ad agency. You know, you'd sit at this oval table and the client's on one side and the ad agency's on the other. And I would sort of scoot over and sit towards the ad agency. And I developed a relationship, a friendship actually, with the art director, because I was so curious about how he saw things, and I wanted to understand his side of the business. So again, it was a way of kind of going beyond the label of what people think marketing is, you know, what the sort of tried and true definition of marketing is, and bringing myself to that job in the ways that I could do best.
When you were you talked about your title as director of socks and belts. What was it? What was it?
This is my it was assistant merchandiser of socks and belts. Isn't that like the most groovy title you've ever heard? This was
and at first you felt badly about it because you felt that it wasn't what it was, but then you were able to own it in that same way.
Yeah, so I left L'Oreal after 3 years because I met the man who was then to be my husband through a sort of a long chain of events. But we ended up moving to San Francisco, and I know this sounds imprudent, but without jobs. And the reason we moved to San Francisco was because it was beautiful, and we really liked the way. I know, all this, you know, you can kind of. So, unfortunately, when we got to San Francisco. And this is very different than it was, this is back in sort of the late 80s, early 90s. I hadn't realized that there weren't a lot of companies that did consumer product marketing. Because at this point, after I left L'Oreal, I was sure I was a marketer, marketer. I'm like, I'm a marketer now. I've learned everything I need to know. And I went out to look for marketing jobs. The only two companies that had really consumer products were Clorox and Del Monte. Now, I had been in the beauty business, and at this point I realized that it wasn't just marketing maybe, it was, you know, I couldn't really see myself going on photo shoots of toilet bowls or ketchup. It just didn't seem to fit. So I was walking down Market Street in San Francisco one day. I had no job. We were at the end of our sort of money supply. This was not a good thing, and my husband then, Antoine, had not had a job either. And I saw a picture of Miles Davis, great jazz musician, and my friend, who was the art director at L'Oreal, had introduced me to jazz. So I admired Miles Davis, and he had his head in his hands. He had this sort of soulful look on his face, gorgeous picture, by a photographer named Annie Leibovitz, who I didn't know at the time. Of course, everybody knows her now. And he was in a black T-shirt, and I looked and it said Gap. Like, wow, Gap is cool. And so I sent my resume, and that began my career at the Gap. The first job I got at the Gap, I know this is a long way into socks and belts, but the first job I got at the Gap, again, well, I had to start over. All of a sudden I was a trainee in retail. I didn't know anything about retail. That's kind of what I mean by the explorer's mind. You know, I got very curious. I saw a poster that appealed to me, and I took a risk on it. My first job, they said, you're going to be in accessories, and your first job is assistant of socks and belts. I'm like, wait, isn't this a fashion business? What do you mean? Like, what are you going to do with socks?
You had visions of Hong Kong.
Because all of my colleagues were going to Hong Kong, and at that time I really wanted to do this. And 35 visits later, I realized I actually didn't really want to go to Hong Kong. But at that point, I was romanticizing these trips that they would take, these 15-hour plane rides that they'd go on. But so I got to be the head of socks and belts. Now, what was interesting about that is that belts at the time for the Gap, for example, had been a really bad business. They had this thing called the braided belt. It sat in a lonely spot at the corner of a Gap store, marked down to $9.99. No one was making any money on it, and nobody cared about the belt business. So I thought, well, this is a great opportunity, right? People were starting to wear more belts. Women were wearing, at that time, stovepipe jeans and kind of had those wide belts. And I'm like, this is fantastic. I can make a business out of it. And it turned out that thankfully, thanks to this new sort of title, socks and belts, I was able to create my reputation as a merchant because I was able to source amazing leather and actually invent a business that hadn't been there for them.
I wanted to add that you actually didn't get there was one of the companies that either Del Monte or Clorox that you got rejected from. I
mean, not even did I get rejected. They didn't even go as far as give me a second interview because I wasn't a classic marketer.
There's a book that someone needs to write called either getting rejected to your way to success or quitting your way to success, because what they didn't see, and part of it is it wasn't the right fit for your talents, but it's also, you get so many rejections, and especially for kids who are in college, when you get, I remember in our dorm we had a wall of rejection letters, and there was something that's okay. that it's okay, it's not the right fit.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because at the time, I mean, I joked that I realized it wasn't really the right job, but at the time I would have taken it, I think, because I really didn't have a job. And, you know, I thought, I guess I could market this stuff too. But I think, you know, they wanted someone from business school, and I had not had a business school background. And fortunately, L'Oreal was, you know, took the risk. I was a trainee, but they took the risk saying, if she can do this for 6 months, perhaps she can continue on. And in effect, I did for 3 years.
I'm going to get to more of your wins, but I want to go through a few more of your low points, because that's what I think resonates a lot with people and with students, is you had a really bad day when you were at the Gap. And you got yelled at, and you had that moment where we've all had, where you don't want to cry at work, but you fight it back, you go to your office, you pick up your phone, and you call your mom.
Yeah.
And we've all
been there. So
when
all
there.
else fails, you just have to know this. Call home. Yeah.
So can you tell us what?
Yeah. So
how that helped?
So I'm a young retailer. I was probably at this point, and I think I was still an assistant, as a matter of fact. I'd probably been in the job maybe 6 or 7 months, and my boss was on maternity leave. And I had the boss above her was a rather tough one. And we had these instruments of torture, as I could call them, called the open to buy. I'm not sure if anyone in there is familiar with retail, but basically this is the way that you track inventory and sales. So you sell so much, you know, that means you have X amount of inventory left. That means you can buy Y amount, right? It's sort of simple math, but for some reason, at that time, it was very elusive to all merchants, because you had to, we penciled it in and erased it. You never knew where your inventory was. Anyway, we were, you know, obviously when goods come into a Gap store or any store, there's a time window. And if they come in late, it's like spoiled milk, right? Because it's out of season. And this happened to be a Paisley backpack that was supposed to come in. I couldn't find it. I didn't know where it was. And I went into this the boss of boss, Damon, and I said, you know, I need your help. I can't find this Paisley backpack. And he sort of very sternly looked up from he was doing something. First he didn't look up at all, and then he kind of said, you know, sent me back to my office and said, if you can't do this, then don't come back in here until you can. And I really thought I had lost my job, because I thought that, you know, I'm just stupid. I just guess I don't understand this. So I called my mom. What was interesting about my mom is she's a wonderfully empathetic woman. So she said, honey, I am so sorry. Maybe this job is just too hard for you. She said, I hate to see you so miserable. Maybe you should find another job. And by her saying that to me, I decided I wanted to stay, and I was going to prove her wrong. No, but I really actually started to think about, well, why am I here to begin with? What is it that I really like about this job? And I started to look at all the people who were working in levels above me and what they got to do and how they were navigating once they had all the information and knowledge that they needed. I thought, I really want to be that. I want to do that. And so, but it was actually quite helpful to have somebody tell me, you know, oh, I'm sorry.
You can quit.
Yeah, you can quit.
And you worked your way up from socks and belts. You continued up through Gap to the point where you were starting Old Navy. You were charged with creating this from nothing. And at the same time, you started having a family.
I did.
And there is an incredible moment personal moment that you shared, where you were pregnant with your second child and you were just all out working on this, and the doctor had to tell you to stop.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, this is in the heyday of Old Navy. For those of you who remember, some of you probably don't, but the Old Navy was a runaway success. We built the business to $0 to $5 billion in 5 years' time. I mean, this is pre-Target being, you know, good at clothing, pre-H&M coming to the United States. And the segment that was so underserved in the market were people who just really didn't want to spend Gap type of money on clothing, or just couldn't afford to, but who really liked fashion. So this concept, in which was quirky and funny, you know, we had
industrial.
You had Morgan Fairchild was doing the commercials, and Carrie Donovan, the great fashion great, was writing New York Times columns for us. You know, we were breaking every single rule. But what it meant also is that we had floods of customers, and that meant floods of work. I mean, floods of work. So I would get into the office at 8 a.m. I'd run from one meeting to the other meeting. Well, first of all, I was working out because I needed to keep trim. So I was working out, going from one meeting to the next meeting, grabbing lunch to go, barely eating, getting home, exhausted. I got to the doctor's office at a normal visit, and she said, you actually are out of amniotic fluid. You got to slow down. And she sort of said, you have to go back in time and time again. But she ended up sort of saying, really take this seriously. It's not just your health, but it's your child's health at risk. And I got to tell you, that was a huge wake-up call for me. I mean, I look back at it and I say, thank God, she came out all right and I was all right. But to sort of take that step and go, why did I take this risk? I could have done it a lot of other ways, but it was a very scary moment.
I'm sure you learned a lot about building your team at that point, where you were responsible for so much, but this was a lesson in delegation for you and the importance of the team that you had supporting you.
Yeah, and I think it's also, interestingly enough, I think it's a lesson in self-care. I think a lot what happens, and there's a story right after that, I don't know if you want me to tell it, but in the book about my other daughter, Pauline, and sort of learning this, I think, to debunk the myth of the perfect work-life balance or perfect mother. But for me, this was simply a question also of, self-care. You can't just, I think, run yourself ragged for your career. And it was something that I hadn't considered. I thought I almost thought my body wasn't part of the me that could just keep going. And it was a scary moment.
Which is also, you also see on college campuses as well, the amount of pressure and stress that students are putting themselves under. One of another really great theme through your life was mentors, and not just the traditional mentors. Some of the advice that I've given in the past has been, don't come up to somebody and ask them to be your mentor, because that's all of a sudden awkward. It's better to find a project and do and actually work and be friends with somebody, and that you can take mentorship. So you've taken mentorship from girlfriends and teachers and bosses.
Yeah, it's so funny. Mentors it's one of those labels, and we immediately have an image of what a mentor is, right? Somebody who's older, somebody who's successful usually in a career that's very similar to yours, if not a few, steps up the ladder from you, maybe in a career that's close, so that they can help you along, provide you with the different connections that you need. So there's this definition that we hold, right, of mentors. For me, and I think I've liked to go a little bit beyond the label on mentors, as it were. And one of the stories I tell in my book is a story about a friend of mine who was named Fleur, who is my...
so much cooler when you say it.
Fleur, who is my roommate in France. And this was back in the 1980s. Actually, the French people didn't even have a word for roommate. I just got really lucky and found this girl because I was so determined to speak French that I would not live with Americans. So I found this amazing woman called Fleur, and who was my age and who was pretty much the opposite of me. So I was a pretty conservative, studied hard, wanted to make sure I get good grades and was successful. And Fleur really liked to have fun. And but she had an incredible way of getting what she wanted and what she needed when she wanted and when she needed it. And the reason she was a mentor to me is, for one, coming from a very conservative Midwestern background, I wasn't always comfortable in the fact that in my body and as a woman. And she did crazy stuff. And if you read the book, you'll hear the stories. But for example, one day I came home from school, and I hear noises from the bathroom, but I hear a man and a woman's noise, her voice and somebody else's voice, and she's in her bath, sitting in her bathtub, naked, obviously, and he is sitting on a closed toilet seat, and they're having a conversation. He is a friend of hers. I thought, that is so weird. How could she do that? That's really like, she's allowing him to, for her, she had a friend over, she wanted to be with him, and it didn't matter to her. She was comfortable enough in her body. And while that's kind of an extreme example, I took something from that. Because it's interesting the way she could be so comfortable in her body, because this is what she wants to do right now. So for me, it was really interesting to watch a very different cultural perspective and learn how to also get comfortable in my own body.
And you talk about how Mickey was a bit of a mentor for you as well. After, sort of right before Mickey left and as he left, Gap was changing. It was becoming a different company. You were still progressing and being promoted. You were running, you were starting to get recruited, but you were running Banana Republic. Can you tell us how it changed and why? And sort of.
So yeah, this is, once Mickey left, is that what you're referring to? Yeah, so Mickey, I think for those who don't know who Mickey Drexler is, he is a really brilliant merchant. And the way that he ran the company was a lot by sort of the emotion that clothing can create, right? You walk into a store, you know what you're gonna buy. You kind of get drawn to things. And he always looked at things like a consumer. So even when he'd walk into a merchandising meeting, he'd like go up to the wall where all your clothing was, and he'd pick up a shirt, he'd go, hate it, love it, hate it. You know? And because he could feel it almost as if he were a customer. The next CEO who came into the Gap was a marketer, and a very talented marketer, but he looked at things much more in boxes, in little categories. So, you know, I remember showing a jacket, a beautiful Banana Republic men's, I think it was like a cashmere coat, and he said, yeah, this is terrible to say, but you know, he said, what guest is this for? Guest because he had been at Disney prior to his job at the Gap. And I went, I sort of stuttered through it and said, I just think it's a great jacket. So I think what changed for the Gap at that time probably got economically much more sound than it was in the States, but sort of the merchant passion about product and that kind of emotional attachment that you get and the understanding of how consumers think shifted. And for me, it shifted in a way that was hard to understand because of my background, because of what I said earlier about story, and because I've studied and loved how images, how products do create emotion with consumers.
And it was at this time that you got recruited for the long recruiting process for Chanel. Mm. And it's such an interesting transition from a much larger mass market company to a company that is the opposite. You know, it's smaller, it's privately held, and it's built on exclusivity.
Right.
But you knew that this was, you were inspired. You took Coco Chanel as one of your mentors, and you knew that you could do this.
Yeah, you know, it sounds sort of implausible sitting here today to think that maybe I would have wanted to stay at the Gap. You think, come on, Chanel, Gap, why would you even consider? But it wasn't. At that time, Gap was kind of the center of the universe. It had been a really successful company. I had a huge future in it. And Chanel was French, which was important for me. But when they came, and we did have a year and a half courtship. But what I came to understand, and the reason I ended up going, was that we had similar values. And I think it's really important for those of you who are going out in the workplace and looking for jobs to really understand what a company values, and to look at your own values seems to be a really, really good way to know if it was a match. And of course, this happened a bit later in my career, but even if you think about the Miles Davis incident, saying that's a question of values. What does a company really value? And I could see that in their advertising. But in this case, over the year and a half that I was interviewing with Chanel, what I learned was it was Coco Chanel's story. And she was an iconoclast. It was a rag to riches story. She had been an orphan. Her father had basically dropped her off in a convent. She taught herself how to sew. She went out and sang in cabarets. She got her business funded by a lot of men. And then she became one of the most successful designers in the world. But more than that, what her clothing intended to do and set out to do was liberate women from the constraints of their times, because they were all in corsets and long gowns and high necklines. So this became an inspiration to me, and when I was interviewing, what I learned that the company cared about was, number one, their heritage in this, and how to bring it forward into the future, but also they cared a lot about creativity. And I cared a lot about creativity. So it ended up being a perfect fit for me. And again, you know, like I said, today it looks really easy, but the company actually was much smaller then.
And it wasn't as it wasn't as fresh, I would say, like fashionably. It wasn't. It was an older, wealthier clientele. And during your tenure there, it really expanded and got edgier, more creative.
Yeah, because you know, it was so interesting about her story, Chanel's story, and it's interesting as you think about companies and brands, modernizing them means actually going back to the essence of them. And so much of my work at Chanel was about what is the essence of what she created, and then how do you bring that into the 21st century? You know, and the essence doesn't mean just the signs and the symbols. It means the deeper truth and the deeper meaning of that brand. And so a lot of the work that I was doing was how do you mine for those gems, and how do you bring them forward to a customer in today's world?
And your timing was actually really interesting. I work in a newspaper, so I know a little bit about disruption. But I hadn't thought about it in terms of what it meant to the luxury market. I knew what it did to retail, but specifically, there were a lot of forces that were completely new and foreign to Chanel that were the opposite of the exclusivity and the rare, how hard it is to sort of attain this brand to this sort of broader audience. You knew this going in. We were sort of on the cusp. I think Facebook was just
early years. Yeah,
was just going. And so, can you talk to us about how this luxury brand, this iconic brand, adjusted and sort of thrived in this disruption?
Yeah. So I took over the CEO in the job in 2007, and this was really shortly after Facebook was gaining a lot of steam. I think it was right before Twitter, and we had started to understand that our premise, which was all about rarity and exclusivity and this high touch with our clients, right? You know, you're selling a $6,000 jacket, you actually want to be able to talk to that client, get it fit. We realized that this was going to be in jeopardy by this big thing called the internet and this thing called social media, which was just burgeoning. I mean, anybody could talk about your brand to anybody else. When you're an authoritative brand and you want to own your image, this looks very scary. The glossy magazines that we like to advertise in, who knew whether they were going to be around? And we had spent a lot of money and bet on a lot of images like that. Boutiques, I mean, you know, God knows Chanel the Boston boutique is beautiful. I mean, you've probably seen it. We redid it when I was there. But you know, think about all the money spent in those boutiques. If everyone's just going to buy online, you know, how do they get the value and the experience of a luxury customer? So this was staring us down, sort of down the pipe. And then there were two other big factors. Globalization. We were all of a sudden seeing customers traveling a lot, particularly an influx of Brazil, Russia, India, China, but mostly Chinese customers. They were flooding our boutiques all over the world. We didn't know their culture, we didn't know their language, we weren't sure how we could best serve them, not to mention the fact that our tried and true customers didn't really feel like they had a place in a boutique that was really, really full, because they were used to having their, you know, sort of really, really high touch service. The third factor, and you know, you'll all understand this because there's been so much written about it, this new generation called millennials. If you think about Chanel and you think about the kind of brand it is, think about any luxury brand, as a matter of fact, the concerns have not been environmental, social, you know, they haven't been about transparency. These are brands that by and large have been much more sort of guarded and hidden. Customers, employees, millennials really wanted to be involved in our business, and we didn't really know how to handle all this. So this was at the onset of the time I was CEO. And the way that I started thinking about it, and I should say one thing, I should sort of pause. So this is 2007. I also come into a team, and I'm a woman of 10 men. So I am actually faced with and I'm not just 10 men, but they were all, most of them European, almost all a decade older than I was. They had all been in the luxury business for 10, some had been there for 20 years, and most of them had already been at Chanel for that long. So here I come in, and my claim to fame is selling $5 t-shirts off the back of a Chevy truck, you know, in Old Navy. So you can imagine how it felt with all these challenges from the outside, and then a huge challenge from the inside of how to actually gain credibility with a team. But what happened is I started to realize that while I was looking at the great unknown, like I didn't know about their business that well. And I'd spent a few years in the US, but I really didn't know the depth of the business or the industry. They were also staring at the unknown because no one knew what was going to happen in the future. And anything that we could look back on the past to try to rely on was going to change. And we did know that. So what I started to think about was, how do you begin to shift leadership behaviors? How do you begin to acquire tools to handle, and sort of culturally, to handle all this change? How can you shift your leaders so that the mindset can actually go into the 21st century in a new way? In other words, we can't rely on the things that we used to do in the past. So, for example, kind of what people are calling command and control leadership wouldn't work anymore, not in this new interconnected world. We would have to actually listen much more keenly to our customers. You know, it's customer-centric, so we'd have to actually be in touch with customers, talk to them, listen to them. We'd have to listen to our employees with all these new millennials who want, you know, access and who want to be contributing to the business. We have to listen more to our teams. We would have to collaborate differently. The internet meant that everything was interconnected, so one division couldn't operate differently than another division. You had to start to work together. You had to be agile. I mean, this change was every day. I mean, you know, first it's Facebook, then it's Twitter, then it's Instagram, then it's LinkedIn. You know what I mean? If you're not agile, and if you don't have an agile mindset, you really can't handle all that change. So what I decided once I realized this is that we actually had to launch a leadership initiative to help all of us acquire these new skill sets, which, by the way, I learned afterwards that many sociologists were calling feminine leadership traits. And I thought, well, that's perfect, Chanel, right? But you know, empathy, sitting in your customer's shoes, listening, collaborating, agility, all these things are being titled or labeled feminine leadership traits. And you know, so it seemed to be logical to me that we'd integrate those kinds of leadership skills into, or behaviors rather, into the things that we already knew how to do. And that was really the beginning of a program, we called it Active and Conscious Leadership Journey initiative that took us, that actually took us 3 years to complete and really, really started to shift the culture.
So by being prepared, by preparing your company and shifting the culture inside, and culture change is something that I think every organization struggles with at some point, and it is extremely hard. You brought in 6 women to join your management team, and you brought in help. You knew that you knew what had to be done, but you had people help. And what was really smart about it is that with this feminine leadership that you emphasize, started with listening to your core group.
Yeah, so I should probably tell you, in full disclosure, that my first discovery of this new idea led me to one of the biggest faceplants of my entire career. Because I got this idea, wow, we have got to do a new leadership program. You know, we've got to get more empathetic, listen better, be more collaborative, all these things that I just mentioned. So, you know, I was looking back at the playbook of a lot of other CEOs, and what do you do in this case? I don't know about leadership programs. I'm going to hire some consultants. And so I hired some consultants from California. Now, don't forget, even with the 6 extra women, there are 20 now people in my team, because eventually we had more people. We had 20 people in the team. Still, most of them are European. I brought in California consultants. It was a month of July. I decided that July would be the perfect time to launch this leadership program. Well, for anybody who has ever lived in France or known anything about France, July is the worst time to get anything done in that country. Mostly because everybody goes away for August, so they're either trying to get everything done or they just can't, you know, their attention is on, you know, the south of France or wherever they're going. And then I corralled my team into this really dusty ballroom, which was probably, and I kid you not, twice the size of this room, somewhere in the west of Paris. There were 20 of us, so you can imagine what that felt like. And it happened to be raining that day. Now that part was not my fault. I mean, you know, I would like to think so, but no, that was not my fault. But I decided that we were going to do some team building exercises. Has anyone done team building exercises?
Is that like 2 truths and a lie?
Yeah, it's like holding hands out in the rain. Well, my team was having none of this. I heard one of the members of the team say, c'est un jardin d'enfants, which basically means this is kindergarten. They were so irate. And then I brought them inside and I told them, we need to be more empathetic. We need to listen better. We need more, so I did everything that I meant not to do. In fact, I kind of was everything that I didn't want to be at that moment. And I think, probably my ideas about what needed to happen were right. But the way I went about it was terribly, terribly wrong. And I realized it because the day there was every mishap you can imagine. And the sort of the way that my team showed me that it was really bad, and this is a sort of typical, I don't know if this happens in France or other countries, but certainly in France it happens a lot, is they take out the calendar so that when you're just about to say, here are the dates that we're going to pursue this initiative, they all show you all the ways they can't do it on the calendar, right? So this was just not going to happen. I got home. I really reflected on it, and I thought, I need to push the reset button. I have done this completely wrong. And I decided that I actually had to embody the change that I wanted to see. I think to quote Gandhi, I think said that, I actually had to be the change I wanted to see. And what that meant for me was actually I wrote them all a letter and said, I want to talk to you, just an hour and a half of your time each individually. And I want you to tell me what you love about this culture, what you think needs to change, how you want to participate, what kind of leader you want to be. Let's just talk. And so I collected, I spent an hour and a half with 20 leaders, so it was almost more than 40 hours. And I collected all their opinions and consolidated them. And then we had a meeting in October where I was able to read back the opinions that they had all given me, and we co-created a document that was our cultural guidelines, kind of in a sense. We called it the from and the tos. So where we want to go from and to. And then from that day on, decided that we were going to create together a leadership initiative that was much more culturally sort of adapted to Chanel and that would really take us into the future in a new way.
I think somebody's going to give me a sign that I need to open it up for questions, but I don't, is that a sign now? Is that a sign now? Okay, so if you want to queue up at these microphones, and if you have a question, and I'll keep asking questions until people line up for them. For looking forward now, I want to ask about what is the future of retail? Given that this disruption is, your career is not a destination, your career is a journey. Disruption is a journey. It's just sort of, it continues to happen, and the good companies continue to adapt. What's the future for retail? What are we looking at?
I wish I had a crystal ball and could tell you exactly, but I can give you my opinion and sort of how I look at the industry right now. I think, and I look at it more generally in terms of brands, not just retail, but I feel like great brands are doing two different things. Number one, they know who they are and what their purpose is. And their purpose isn't just to sell logoed items. It's not just to sell stuff. It's something deeper than that engages all of us in what we care about. So I think of brands, I think of things like REI, and it's both a brand and a retailer, and they're doing their opt-out Black Friday again this year, I just saw online. This is a brand that cares about
They're closing on Black Friday and letting their employees have a day off.
Yeah, and this is a brand that actually cares about people getting outside. We feel it when we go into the stores, when we talk to their sales associates, when we know that they're closing on Black Friday, the busiest day of the entire retail year. So, they embody a purpose. And I think brands that can do that, plus can actually move into the future and engage customers in different ways, are the brands that are going to win. I think for retail itself, so what we call retail, and the term is actually more general than just boutiques, but we think a lot about stores when we think about retail. I feel like the store itself isn't going to go away. There's been a lot of talk about what's going to happen to what they call bricks, which are the stores, and I feel like their role will shift. So instead of just being a place where you have a transaction and you buy something, stores are going to be a place maybe where you have a connection. Maybe there's something, sort of a community thing that's going to happen. People have talked about entertainment in stores, but I think the store that we'll see less retail, or less, bricks, as it were, and we'll see those stores mean something much more to the customer in a different way, not just as a place, because you can transact on the internet. That's my guess, best guess.
You can line up at these microphones here if you have a question. Please don't be shy. What are some other brands besides REI that you feel like are doing it right? So what I'm hearing from you is that people are looking, brands have to be authentic, they have to tell their story in different ways, and sort of, you talked about with Chanel, getting to your core, getting to your roots of who you are, and that can be anything from a newspaper to a car company. I know you've talked a bit about Tesla.
Right.
And what do you think a brand like Tesla is doing right?
You know, I think what's so interesting for me, and I use that example when I think about luxury, because luxury brands are interesting in as much as it's just as, you know, to me, it's just as big of a challenge for them. And I had read that Tesla, I think it was 2015, I don't know what happened in 16, but their best model had beat BMW and Mercedes in sales. And I thought that was astonishing, because I look back at BMW and Mercedes are heritage brands. And they're, you know, they've had a long history, and Tesla's brand new, but we look at it as a luxury brand. And if I think about the components of luxury in general, heritage has always kind of been an important part. So I said, oh, that's kind of that's sort of disruptive. What I think is amazing about Tesla is you have every bit as luxury, you know, the product is every bit as luxurious. And this is, I started talking about that prior to their newest launch and their, you know, their lower end car. But what I think is amazing is you've got a beautiful appointment. It is a technological innovation. It is, you know, you get in a Tesla, it smells good, it feels good, and it's doing something good for the environment. So I look at that and I say, that's, as a customer, if I had a choice and I was going to buy a luxury car and I had that much money, I really might want to buy a Tesla, because I wouldn't, you know, I won't, instead of wearing the badge Mercedes that tells everybody that I can afford a car, this tells everybody I might be able to afford a car, but I also am investing in something that's better than polluting our environment. So to me, there's something really interesting about that, both purpose and luxury combined, that I had not seen when I first started talking about it.
Really interesting. Oh, look, we have questions. We'll start over here.
Oh, I love that. I was going to ask for the lights to be on the whole time. This is so much better. I can see everyone.
You can start.
Hi, my name is Connie, and I'm a third-year student at Northeastern. I have a question about how you said feminine leadership, which is really interesting to me, because a lot of top female leaders nowadays talk about sort of blending in and not, you know, standing out among like male leaders. So what's your take on that? And what would you say to college young female students who want to go to industries which are traditionally male-dominated, like finance or tech, compared to fashion? So just
you know, it's so interesting. I know, somebody once asked me if the work that I'd done in leadership would apply to the banking industry or to a law firm. And I think it would, because what was so interesting is when you talk about something like feminine leadership, and I'm not sure how I feel about the actual label itself. I mean, I wrote a book called Beyond the Label, so, but I mean, I think it's one way you can talk about it, because when you think about it, those are qualities that men and women possess. They're not really just feminine leadership qualities, right? So my feeling is that you need a balance, right? It's not just having empathy and listening and being agile and being collaborative. Those are things seem to have been underestimated in corporations, but I think are becoming increasingly important, because to me they're 21st century qualities. They're things we all need. That said, it doesn't mean that there aren't times that you actually have to be, you know, strong, that you have to be determined, that you have to have a strategy, that all the things that we also learn. To me, it's actually about the integration of those qualities. And the reason I pull those qualities out, or did when I was at Chanel, is because my observation was these aren't things that we talk about a lot, because we call them soft skills. But these soft skills are going to be game changers in the 21st century.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Laura. I'm a third year com major.
You're a what?
I'm a third year com major.
We met already.
Communications.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. As you can tell by my master communication skills. I have a question. You said something about having to do a job that you don't always love, and I was wondering if you had like any advice for people who find themselves in jobs that they end up just hating.
Yeah, great question. You know, I have had, like I told you, I was the head of socks and belts. So I'm not going to say that I went into that job thinking I loved it. You know, I feel like no matter what job you're in, it's finding within that job the thing that you can get excited about. And figuring that no matter what, even if you leave it, there's something to learn. It's kind of like, you know, the story I told about Damon, my really tough boss. One of my insights after that story was even a tough boss you can learn from. I mean, in that case, one of the things I learned from is how I didn't want to be. But I think in a job that you get into that isn't the perfect job, think about what it is that you can find in that job that really interests you. But also think about, you know, what are the things that I can take away from this job? And sort of in that questioning and being in that constant questioning, I think, will help you navigate if, in fact, I hope you're not going into a job that you don't like, but you know, you never know. Yeah, you know, but it happens. It happens, and I think sometimes it takes until afterwards, you know, to be able to say, this is what I've learned. But certainly, like I took a job at Gap because it sounded really prestigious. It was a head of denim. And I actually didn't, it's strange, I love jeans, but it wasn't a very fun job because a lot of it was figuring out where fabric was going from and to. But I learned a lot during that job, and it helped me refine what it was I did like. So just being in those questions. You're welcome.
Hi, so first off, thank you for your time. This has been really interesting and empowering.
Thank you.
So I'm Rebecca, I'm a fourth-year computer engineer. My question is if you could provide a little bit more insight on what it's like to balance, you know, your corporate climb with building a family, and if you have anything else to add to that. You already touched on it, but...
Yeah, can I tell a story? Yeah. Do we have time for a story?
I think we do. I don't see anybody
because it's one it's always hard to tell, but I think it may be important, and even if you're a student. So this is the follow-up story after I had the incident with, you know, in the book after the incident with my first daughter. So I have an unusual background in as much as I was married to a man who actually stayed home and took care of the kids. Not at first, by the way. We both actually wanted to have careers, but we were living in San Francisco. Having a nanny was way too expensive for us. So believe it or not, paying a nanny was more than my husband was actually making at the time. Besides, we wanted one of us to be closer at home to the kids. So he decided to stay home, and I decided to pursue my career. It seemed to work out well. You know, I mean, the kids seemed happy. It wasn't easy. This is back again in like the 90s, so there were people in my community who were wondering if he actually had a wife, and there were people back in France, or his family, saying to him, you know, you should be in an office and she should be at home. It wasn't easy, but the kids were happy. It worked out. Until I realized something very different, which is I was on a college tour. I took my...
You were right here at Oleana.
I was actually, yeah, exactly. Is that restaurant still around?
It is.
So
it's still
good.
Very good.
Yeah, I was in Cambridge. I was at that other school, which I think my daughter probably sensed, because we were on one of those tours, which you guys have all done, with the tour guide who tells you the 10 things why this school's the best school in the world. Of course, and this is at Harvard, and I went to Yale, and I'm probably really frustrated in showing it. The day was difficult. It was hot. I couldn't wait to get to dinner. We went to Oleana, and you know, the plates are going by, and I'm smelling it, and I'm hungry, and I want a glass of wine. I'm over this. And my daughter was not in a great mood that night either, because I think she could feel my anxiety with all this. And I said something like, let's get this, this, and this, and we can share. And I'm like, oh, you don't like to share. It's something I thought was really unimportant. It was if I had struck a match and threw it into a pile of dry leaves. Pauline exploded. I mean, exploded. She said, how can you tell me who I am or what I'm supposed to do when you were never there? You never went to my soccer games, you weren't at my recitals, you weren't at my after-school activities. Daddy did everything. You were never there. You were always jetting off to Hong Kong or to France. How could you tell me this? So any hunger that I had at that point went away. My tongue started to swell in my mouth. My ears got hot. I didn't know what to do. I got up, I ran into the bathroom, and I just broke down. I mean, I broke down. I sobbed like the gut-wrenching kind of sob that you can't stop. And I went through this whole wheel of emotions, like crazy, sadness, like what have I done? What have I ruined her life? Have I ruined our relationship? How could I have been so stupid? I went through even anger, like, wait a minute, we're at Harvard. If we can afford Harvard, it's because of the work that I've done. Everything you can think of, regret, everything you can think of. Finally came back out. The rest of the meal was in silence, and we never actually reconciled. A few months went by, And she was doing her famous college essays. You guys all know about these. And she was sitting in her bedroom with her, she has beautiful green eyes, you know, hands on her chin, on her rug. She's like, Mom, can you help me with my college essays? And so I went into her room. One of the roles that I had actually is, we had kind of divided our roles, was Antoine was responsible for getting the kids to where they needed to go and being for them on the day-to-day. And I was the emotional support, you know, friends and all that kind of stuff, but I was also the academic support because he was French and didn't know really the American system. So I said, sure, honey, I'll help you with your essays. And we sat down and we brainstormed, and she came up with a beautiful idea. And I walked out and she said, thanks, Mom. I thought, okay, well, maybe I'm not such a terrible mom. I don't know. Then, sort of a year or so later, maybe a couple of years later, I went to the Yale campus, and I would do what they called college teas, where I'd go and speak to students. And Pauline, my daughter, would bring a posse of friends, like 10 friends. And afterwards, Mom, can you have dinner with my friends? Can you tell them about your career? And I realized that she was actually proud of me, and that maybe things had not been perfect, but that she actually, wanted me to talk to her friends and talk about my career. So she was proud. And the reason I tell this, there's one more part. The punchline was, she was graduating from college, and I got one of those telephone calls, Mom, can you help me find my first job? And we brainstormed, just like we did with the college essays, and she came up with what she really wanted to do, which was work in the food industry. And I ended up helping her get her first internship. So she wrote me a text that said, Dear Mom, you never cooked or cleaned, but you know what? I'd rather have a mom who can help me find a job. So, that if there's a moral to the story, which I'm not sure there is that we have a lot of expectations, and we have a lot of labels on perfect work-life balance and being a perfect mom or a perfect student or perfect this or perfect that. And those expectations, those labels end up hurting us because they make us always feel really, really bad about what we've done. And what I've learned in that is that, I wasn't a perfect mom, but I don't think anyone here could claim that they were a perfect parent or perfect anything. I did the best that I could. I did what I cared a lot about, and I gave her what I cared about. Did I have sadness? Did I have regrets? Yeah. Was it hard to miss those everyday activities, the tooth falling out and the funny words that she said? Yeah, it was really hard. I was at an event like this, and somebody raised their hand after I told this story and said, so, do you regret your career choice? And I said, no, I had a really vibrant career, and I loved it, and I'm happy that Pauline, I think, was proud of me as a mother, and I'm happy that I could give her something different. But of course, I regret some of the times, and the one thing I do say I regretted, and something just to learn from, is that I wish we'd had the conversations as she was growing up. I wish we had talked about this, and for students, if you can talk to your parents about it, and for parents to talk to your students about it, just to be able to sort of be honest in where you are in that. Because there were times when I'd go off to Hong Kong and I'd call home and she wouldn't get on the phone, or she wouldn't say, I miss you. Or there were times I was crying in the airplane. If I could have shared those, and she could have shared with me, I could have opened it up so she could have shared with me. But then somebody else raised their hand and said, so if you could have afforded to stay at home, like either part-time or full-time, would you have done it? And I said, no, I really, I really liked what I did. And then I said, but I have an insight for you. I think this is true. I said, whether you decide to stay home full-time, whether you decide to be a part-time mom, at some point, your kid will hate you. And it's true, right? I mean, at some point. So I think, it's just, for me, it's an important story about sort of how, when you go into the workplace, to not expect something perfect, and to know that you'll make compromises, and you won't get everything you want, but you'll get most of what you want if you actually can figure out what that is.
I'll add on to that. I have a 4-year-old who is asking me why I work. Why do you work, Mom? Why aren't you home when I get home from school? And it's a hard question, but I explained as well as I could to a 4-year-old that this is something that I have to do. Just like he has to go to school, my hours just aren't as good as his hours.
I love that. That would have been great. That's great that you had the conversation.
I don't think he forgives me, but.
Question feels pithy now after that response, but I'll still ask it. My name is Andrea, and I'm a part-time MBA student here. And my question is regarding companies like REI, or just a trend in general of companies trying to embody certain values, or even trying to push certain values like female empowerment. And so when you compare a brand like Dove, who has had many different campaigns, marketing campaigns that have been successful and unsuccessful, but then you also compare one like Always, which had that commercial with the girls saying, what does it mean to be a girl? So what do you feel like is a difference for companies like that? How is it that one company can not necessarily come off like they're just pushing this value to sell something versus coming off as, I don't know, something
It's a really good question. For me, you have to live the values. So the reason I pick REI is because they actually, maybe it's, I don't know if it's because they sacrifice the biggest shopping day, in the year, basically, to endorse something that they care about. And it's not, to me, and it wasn't actually even an ad campaign. It started with #opt-out. And so I feel like, for me, the difference is not appropriating a cause because it makes you look good, but actually living into a cause in everything that you do. So for example, if you're gonna say that you're, about women's empowerment, your employee programs better reflect that. You're at store level, you better feel that. So I think everything has to actually, it can't be sort of just a thing that you borrow so that you look good. So that's what I would say if I were running another company. It's like, how do you do this in every place that you exist and communicate, not just communicate it, but be it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And unfortunately, I'm getting a sign, but we'll do one more question.
Hi, my name is Jackson. I'm a first-year undecided student.
A first-year what?
Undecided student. And,
undecided, okay.
Oh, I love it.
And this question has been bothering me for a long time, is when you work at a higher position in the company like Chanel, how do you balance between having like great shopping experiences, like the most beautiful cardigan product with exclusivity, and all those mind-blowing fashion shows, and being profitable as a corporation at the same time?
How do you get it? How do you make it happen? This is the most confounding thing to me when I first started. And the reason it was so confounding to me was not only, are you paying so much to give that exceptional experience and those beautiful images, but you're actually trying not to sell a lot of things, right? You're like, how does that make money? But it seems impossible, doesn't it? But actually, it isn't, because, well, for one, you have high margins. So part of it is that you have you're able to do that because you have high margins. But also, the more that you actually create that exclusivity, the greater the demand. And so those businesses depend on actually creating consistent demand. And they're businesses in general, and I'm talking about most of the luxury companies, that look actually over long term. So they're not, in some respects they're publicly traded, so they have to report their sales and their earnings. But in others, they're really over long-term, at long-term profits. But essentially the value is created because you have beautiful products, and so you're using beautiful materials, and so you can charge a lot of money. Right? So if you're doing beautiful things, if you have a high touch, that allows you to raise your prices and therefore make high margins, which make money. Does that make sense? But I have to tell you, I'll never forget joining the company and thinking, how do they do this? They're trying to sell less bags and not more handbags? I don't understand how this formula works, but it does.
Thank you.
Thank you. These are great questions. Thank you for sharing your story with us.
Thank you. Thank you for great questions.
Her book is called Beyond the Label. It is a great read, and they're full of even more great stories of just life, leadership, and working. So please check out her book, and thank you.
Thank you. It was great to be here.
Thank you to Diane.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who came, and Maureen, Linda, thank you. You not only take us beyond the label, you take us beyond our expectations. You've been so generous with your time. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, that's so sweet.